Hi, today we're going to talk about money in the international context, and more specifically about how money crosses borders. All right, so now I assume that by now you have some basic understanding of what financial markets are and how they work. So instead of giving you definitions of the basic things related to financial markets, like what is liquidity, what is debt, what is equity, I will assume that you kind of know those things and will focus on the specific aspects of those factors, how they play out in the international context. Now, when I teach this course in class, I started with a question that I would like you to answer anyway, and that question is, if you happened to have access to the future information about currency exchange rates, how much money or what would be your return on investment in the long run? In other words, imagine that you find this website that is called, let's call it tomorrow.com. And that website gives you the exact information that you would see on the internet, let's say tomorrow or a week from now or a year from now. So that enables you to know the exchange rate for every single currency at every single second in the future. So the question is, how much money do you think you would be able to get over time, or more important, what would be your return on investment over time on the money that you have? And just to give you some indication as to what the normal returns on investment are, I'll give you a few examples. For example, if you keep your money in a savings account, you normally would be getting 1 to 3% annually. There were times when those percentages were slightly higher. There were times when they were slightly lower. Like, for example, today, at least in the United States, you hardly ever get more than 1% annual on savings accounts, but that's roughly the range. If you go with term deposits, which is basically a savings account, but where you cannot withdraw your money until turn time, like within the next 90 days or 1 year, you can expect to get again anywhere between 2 to 5% on your deposits. And again, those could be slightly different depending from what currency you use. They actually can be substantially higher, up to 15 or even 20% if you use a very unstable currency, but then the inflation will actually eat it up. So the effective real return on investment would be roughly 2 to 5%, maybe 6 or 7 if you have a large amount frozen for a long period of time. Then you have bonds, and so bonds normally offer 3 to 7% annually, and stocks, again, times change from time to time, but historically over the last century or so, stocks have been yielding about 8% annually, plus or minus 10 depending on the period. Now, I would ask my students, how much would you expect to get as a return? Let's say you have $100 to start with. How many dollars would you end up at the end of the year if you knew in future, in any second in the future, the exchange rate of every single currency on this planet, and you were allowed to buy and sell foreign currencies as frequently as you want? And so I encourage you to pause here and try to answer that question for yourself, just so you get an idea, and then I'll give you the answer. Now, whatever you chose as your answer, write it down. I'll tell you that most of my students believe that they can make 10 to 15% on this sort of information. Now, then I would show you a graph that looks like this, and this is the exchange rate of the Canadian dollar versus the American dollar. So here you have the two very stable currencies. So the graph would look much wilder, the ups and downs, if you, for example, compare the exchange rate of, let's say, the American dollar to Russian ruble, or euro to, for example, I don't know, Ukrainian hryvnia. So there you would see even greater swings. But even if you take two very stable currencies like the Canadian dollar and the American dollar, you would still see that there are huge fluctuations in the currency valuations. And the graph would look almost the same if you looked for a particular day. So you would see that the exchange rates change by 1%, sometimes 2 or 3 or even 5% within one day, especially when you look at more volatile currencies, as I said, like the Russian ruble. In the past several months, there have been days when Russian ruble would gain literally up to 5% a day or lose up to 5% a day, and sometimes within even hours. So if you, for example, invested your money in, let's say, Canadian dollars in 2002 and waited until 2008, you would have seen an annual increase of about 14%. If you didn't do anything, just invested and waited. From 2007 to 2008, you would have seen an annual return of about 30%. If you look at other, like for example, if you invested in August 8 and then withdrew the money on September 8, within that one single month, you would see an annual equivalent return on investment of 200%. Now again, if you were able to do that with every single currency, and you knew the exact exchange rates in the future at every given second, it's impossible to say what your return on investment would be. I mean, it would be huge. It would be in thousands and thousands of percent. In fact, the only restricting factor here would be that soon enough you will have so much money that when you trade that amount of money, you would affect the exchange rates on the markets, and so that would lead to all kinds of problems and restrictions. But other than that, you can literally, have your wealth multiplied by a factor of thousands within a matter of years. So the point of this exercise is to show you that currencies fluctuate tremendously. So as I said, sometimes even within hours there would be swings within several percentage points. And so if you would just, buy here, sell here, buy here, sell here, buy here, sell here, and you knew when those precise moments would occur, you could actually make a lot of money. Now let's talk a little bit about capital markets. And again, just some very basics. I hope you understand how capital markets work. So you essentially have two groups of people. One group has money and the other group needs money. And so those who have money give them to those who need money, and in exchange they charge either interests or dividends, right? So people who have excess money, they want to multiply that money, so they want to make even more money, and so they would offer their money as a loan, or they would be willing to invest in your company in exchange for equity in your company. And then if you need money, let's say for example you want to buy a new toy or open a new business and you need money to finance that operation, you could either borrow the money, in which case you would be paying interests. So you would, let's say, borrow $1,000 and you promise to pay back the same $1,000 a year later plus interest, whatever the interest rate is, let's say plus 5%. So this way the person who gives you the money gets a little extra for letting you use his or her money, and you on the other hand pay to that person for the right to use that money for a while. Or alternatively, you could let's say you want to expand your business and you need money for that, so you wouldn't promise to pay a particular amount at a particular time. You would say, well, if you give me money, half of my company would be yours, and so whatever you make in your profits over that time would be split 50-50. Plus the person can always take his money back, sell his or her half of the company to somebody else, to you or somebody else, and basically get his value back. And if the value of the company changes over time, as it often happens, the person who invested the money in your company can make even more if the value goes up, or actually lose something if it goes down. Now, so as we said, there are two main types or two main reasons why people would give money to others, and that's, as we said, debt. That's where you loan money for interest, or equity. That's where you invest money for a share of the profit and the business. Now you have two different types of banks. You have what we call commercial banks and you have investment banks. So commercial banks primarily specialize in loans. So those are the banks that would give you the money, and in exchange they would pay you you would pay them the interest. So those are the types of bank where you would go to get a mortgage, or to get a loan for your car, or just borrow some money for whatever else you need. And normally they would be working with individuals who give money to banks. So for example, if you have a checking account or a saving account, most likely, not most likely, it's pretty much certainly you have that account with a commercial bank. And so in this case, you lend the money to the bank, and the bank gives you some interest. In most cases, it would be a very small interest on a checking account, and a little greater interest on the saving account. Though again, because the bank offers you all kinds of services, like for example, access to ATM machines, a bank card, they may actually be charging you a few dollars a month for those services. So, but in any case, people like us, citizens or companies, put our money in commercial banks, and commercial banks pay us some interest for using our money. In turn, they would lend that same money to others who need the money, people like us, companies like us, and charge them interest. And usually they charge more interest for loans than they paid to us for our deposits, and that's how they make their profits. Investment banks specialize in equity, so they would be looking for companies that have potential to grow, and so they would, rather than loan that money, they would invest that money for usually a share of the business. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would literally meet with entrepreneurs and decide on which ones they want to invest in, though that happens sometimes too. But it's usually venture capitalists and angel investors who actually meet face to face and make those investments. Equity banks normally just trade, buy shares, sell shares, have all kinds of financial instruments that represent shares of companies. So in many cases, they wouldn't be actually meeting with the company representatives for that. So they would be trading shares of businesses as well as other financial instruments, but again, in hopes that in the future they will make some money when the value of those financial instruments increases. Now, let's talk about the international context. The big question then becomes, why would anyone want to either lend or borrow money internationally, or why would anyone want to sell shares of companies or buy shares of in companies internationally? And the answers are kind of obvious, but there are some that may not be so obvious. Well, if you want to borrow money, or if you seek capital for expansion of your business in exchange for equity in your business, you have a number of advantages of going international. First, you would have access to a larger number of potential investors or lenders. Who knows, maybe in your country nobody wants to give you money, or they can give you money, but they will give you only for a very high part of your company, large part of your company, or for a very high interest. If you go international, there is a very good chance you will find someone who will be willing to give it to you for a lesser percent. And so as a result, it may be cheaper for you to get money that way, plus you may have more potential lenders from whom you can get the money. So potentially you can raise more for less. For lenders, more or less the same things, so you can choose more borrowers, and you can lend your money to more people, and often you could find people overseas or companies overseas that are willing to pay more for your money. For example, in the United States today, if you wanted to lend money as a bank or just lend money, normally people would expect that you would charge anywhere between 2.5% to maybe 5% annually, especially if it's some sort of like a mortgage or something where you have some sort of a collateral, some sort of property that you can seize if the borrower doesn't pay the money back. So if you have money, at best, when you lend, you can expect to get about, as I said, 2 to 5% from the borrower. If you were willing to expand your pool of borrowers and lend your money to people, let's say in Ukraine, in Africa, in some Asian countries, where the situation is much less stable and the interest rates are hugely higher, you could actually lend your dollars for 10 and maybe even 15% annually. So you can make much more on your money. Obviously, it increases risks, and we'll talk about them later. But as far as return on investment, if everything goes fine, you can dramatically improve your profitability. Additionally, you can also spread your risks. Imagine that you are lending your money only to the people in your country. Let's say, for example, I'm now in the United States, I'm a bank, and let's say I have some money from either deposits or whatever other sources, and I want to lend them, and all the money that I lend go to American, let's say, homeowners, right? So I have given out millions of dollars, and people use that money to buy houses, and they're paying back. But then what if we have a crash in the market, just like what we had a few years ago in 2008, and all of a sudden all my borrowers are not able to pay back? So I would go bankrupt. So if I were lending internationally, I would actually be in a much better shape. Yes, maybe the interest rates would be not always as high as they could be in, let's say, your own country. But if something crashes in, let's say, the United States, you may still be making a healthy profit, let's say in Germany or in China or in Australia. And so as a result, a downturn in one market doesn't affect your overall well-being dramatically, and so you're still keeping your head above water. Now, here's a question that you're likely to see on the exam. And the answer is clearly E. All of these are true statements. Now, in the recent years, we've seen a huge increase in internationalization of capital markets. Today, businesses, banks, people borrow and lend money internationally at a much higher rate than it was before. The question then is, why is it happening more now than it did before? And there are a number of very important reasons. One, of course, is the information technology. Let's say 50 years ago or 100 years ago, if you wanted to either lend your money internationally or borrow money internationally, or let's say, for example, invest a company overseas, what you would have to do, you would literally have to put your money in a suitcase, board a ship, go to a different country, wherever it is, sometimes spending weeks or even months reaching there, then literally pay with that money. And even then, it was probably not the actual paper money. You would probably need to use gold or silver, because the currency exchange markets were either non-existent or not as functional as they are today. So your whatever currency your country used at that time probably was not acceptable or would not be accepted in a different country. So you literally would first have to buy some sort of an universal equivalent of wealth, like gold or silver, put it in a bag, get on a boat, go to a different country, buy the share or make the investment, and then come back. And it's very difficult. It would take, as I said, weeks and sometimes months to do it. You would have no way of keeping track of what's going on with the company that you invested in. So it was just very difficult to do from the technical point of view. Today, you can literally make an investment from your cell phone. And as you're listening to this lecture, if you are at a computer, and obviously you are, you could probably buy some shares in a company, let's say in China or India or Lithuania or Ukraine, right now from right here, or same thing from for the United States company, for American company. Second big difference is that today we live in a largely or comparatively deregulated world. If decades ago or years ago or centuries ago, there were all kinds of restrictions on how you could lend money internationally, borrow money internationally, keep your money in foreign accounts, buy foreign companies. Today, many of those restrictions have been lifted, and it's much easier and legal to make such investments. If you live in so-called developed world, Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, there are normally no restrictions on movement of capital. So let's say you are in the United States and you want to buy shares in a company that is in Australia, you can do that. There are no restrictions. I mean, obviously, if you make profits on that transaction, you would still be required to pay the taxes, but that's a whole different story. So, but as far as buying, sure, you can do that. I mean, as long as the money is yours, there are no restrictions. Again, there may be, as I said, some regulations as far as how you pay taxes, but other than that, no restrictions whatsoever in most countries, whereas they were just, years ago. And finally, there are now financial instruments that allow you to make those transactions easily, that are specifically designed for those kinds of purposes. There are all kinds of shares and all kinds of bonds and all kinds of other instruments that sometimes package different financial instruments within them, and they might be specifically designed for international trading, specifically for clients, let's say in the United States, to buy American financial instruments and thereby invest in those ventures or lend to those types of organizations. And that makes it even more easy, even much easier to make those kinds of transactions. Now, a few words about so-called offshore financial centers. So that's what we call tax havens or offshore jurisdictions. So basically, in a classic example, those would be small island nations that have very secretive laws or protect secrecy of their clients, and that's where you could presumably hide your money. And so the best examples would be like the British Virgin Islands, or some countries that are not necessarily islands, like for example Liechtenstein or Switzerland, that are notorious for harboring money in anonymous accounts from people from all around the world, and some of that money potentially could be even drug money or whatever other unlawful types of incomes. And so if I teach this class to my students in class, I would ask them whether or not they think the existence of the offshore financial centers is good or bad for their country. For America, if you are from America, if you happen to be from a different country, do you find the existence of those bad for your country or good for your country? Most people feel that they are bad, so that they hurt the economy more than they help. And that claim is not without merit, but there is more to it than meets the eye. So let's watch a short video about the offshore financial centers, and then we'll talk a little bit about how it works.
The Justice Department and the IRS filed suit this week to track down people who use offshore bank accounts to cheat on their taxes. Credit card companies have been asked to hand over records that could expose more than 1 million tax evaders, many wealthy Americans, who have found an illegal home for their money in foreign tax havens. ABC's Linda Douglas is on the money trail.
The Cayman Islands has just about everything a rich person could want. Glorious beaches, privacy, and a place to hide money from the IRS so it can't be taxed. More than a dozen countries offer secret bank accounts, but IRS investigators say they were stunned to discover just how many Americans may be using them.
There's a potential for 1 to 2 million taxpayers to have these kinds of accounts overseas.
On the internet, banks and so-called financial advisors offer Americans tax avoidance and strict secrecy if they set up accounts in countries where banking laws protect privacy. The secret accounts come with credit cards. No name appears on your card.
The IRS says offshore accounts are used mostly by self-employed professionals who report their own earnings to the government. Doctors, lawyers, entertainers, people whose income is in the top 1%.
Investigators say many Americans are living off credit cards tied to those accounts.
To charge rental cars, to charge airline tickets, to charge meals, to charge tuition for their kids in school. They are using it for the daily expenses of life, actually.
Offshore accounts are not illegal, but not paying taxes on the money in them is.
These taxpayers that are going offshore to avoid paying their fair share of taxes are not moral, ethical, and they're surely illegal.
Some tax experts doubt there are 1 million+ tax cheats because the cost of getting caught is so high.
It's a very dangerous audit lottery that they're playing, because if indeed they are caught and they have no real defenses, then they are going to go to jail under the sentencing guideline rules.
But only 1 in 160 tax returns is ever audited. It is a dangerous game that more Americans may be willing to play. Linda Douglas, ABC News, Washington.
So now let's recap the most important points from this short video. So it's very important to understand that keeping money overseas is not illegal. You can definitely have an account in a different country, at least by the laws of most of the countries, including you can have an account in, for example, Cayman Islands or in Switzerland or Liechtenstein or the Virgin Islands, whatever other country you choose to. So that part is legal. You can do that. What you cannot do is to put money in those accounts, for example, put your profits in those accounts and not report them to your own country, for example, to the IRS in the United States or whatever tax organization you have in your own country. So keeping money overseas normally is perfectly legal, except for maybe a few countries that have those restrictions. Not paying taxes on the incomes hidden in or kept in a foreign account is not legal. Second, why would you want to have your money in a foreign account? Well, first of all, you may be getting a better deal on your investment there. As discussed before, foreign banks may be paying higher interest rates on your deposits. For example, in the unstable Russia or Ukraine today, deposits in US dollars often yield 10 to 15% annually, which is much higher than what you can make on dollar deposits in the United States. So you might want to open an account in one of those countries and get a higher return. It's more risky, but you can do that. The tax havens, so-called tax havens like Switzerland or Liechtenstein, do not necessarily pay a higher interest rate, but they may offer you secrecy. So if you put the money there, they may not even ask who you are, so they would create an account, give you some sort of passcode for the access, and so only you can access that account as long as you know the passcode. But they may not even know your identity, or would know the identity but would not reveal it to anyone unless you authorize it. Now the question becomes, why would you want to put money in an account that doesn't give you a higher return and offers you secrecy? Well, this is where it gets tricky. If you are an employee at a regular organization, you work from 8 till 5, you make your whatever the salary is in your country. Let's say in the United States you make $40, $50, $60, $70,000 a year, maybe even $100,000 a year. First of all, when your employer pays you, the income taxes are withheld automatically. So when you get the paycheck, it's not like you can keep the taxes first and then pay them later. No, they will be automatically withheld by your employer. Now, if you happen to be self-employed, though, like for example, let's say you're a doctor or an entertainer, like a singer or artist, you create paintings and you sell them, or you're a consultant or an accountant, so you have your own company and you work for yourself, then you are in a situation where you would be paid by the clients first, and then it's your obligation to pay taxes on your income normally once a year, depending on how your business is set up. So let's say, for example, you have a business that offers consulting services. Let's say you solve all kinds of accounting problems or whatever other problems for businesses, right? And let's say there is a company XYZ that wants to hire you, and let's say you settled for $100,000 for the contract. It will take you a month to complete, and they will pay you $100,000 for this work. Now, you give them a contract and they ask you, where do you want us to pay the money? Now, you can choose to either be paid to you personally, so they would write you a check, or you can ask to pay to your business if you have a business set up for your consultancy, and you can give them just about any account where the money should be deposited. To them, it doesn't really matter. So when they write it, it could be to your XYZ Consulting, to you as an individual, and it doesn't really matter to them what country that account is in. But even if they pay to you, again, once you get the money, you technically can move it to any account without depositing it in the United States. Now, this is where it gets tricky. If you make some little money and if you move the money to a foreign account, and if that foreign account offers secrecy, and if that allows you to not show the money to the IRS and as a result not pay taxes on it, that can be a difference between quite a large, income. So let's say if your contract is $100,000, and in the United States, in that bracket, if you make hundreds of thousands a year, you would be paying income tax, personal income tax, usually around 30% or so, and I believe the highest bracket is 35%. And if it's business income with the business taxes, it's a fixed 35%, right? So if you were able to avoid paying that money, all of a sudden that tax, all of a sudden you are saving $35,000 out of your $100,000 contract. And this is not a huge amount. I mean, many doctors, many, as I said, consultants, they would be making much more in a year. And so here you have a situation where all of a sudden, end of the year, you have to pay your taxes. Let's say you made $1 million, which is not unheard of. And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, man, I have to pay $350,000. That's the price of a good house. That's a lot of money. Maybe I shouldn't show it to the IRS. Maybe I should just keep it in my offshore account and never even report to the IRS that I had that money in the first place. And then, as it was explained in the video, you can even have a credit card or a debit card associated with that account. It may not even bear your name, and so you can literally use that money to, spend, to charge your expenses, daily expenses, food, restaurants, whatever. And so then all of a sudden, as I said, the choice becomes much more difficult. I mean, it's a difference between a huge amount that you could get or you could pay in taxes. And that's when many people think, yeah, I don't know, I hate paying taxes. I earned that money and I don't want to pay it to the IRS or to the, in the form of taxes. So maybe I should explore the options of keeping that money somewhere overseas and asking my clients to pay to my accounts directly in Panama, Virgin Islands, Bermudas, Bahamas, Luxembourg, and so on and so on. So again, technically you can still put the money there, but you would have in the end of the year to say to the IRS that, well, this is how much I earned, and yes, the money is in that account, but here is your tax on that amount that I earned in the United States or overseas. It's especially tempting to use one of those offshore accounts if your clients are overseas as well, especially if they're also registered in those offshore accounts, offshore financial centers. Then while you may be physically in the United States, you may be offering the services to someone who is not in the United States, who will not report that they paid to you, to the US government. And so then it becomes very, very difficult for the US government to catch you. And so that's when it becomes very, very tempting to use those tax evasion tactics. Is it worth it or not? Well, it's illegal, so I'd say sure, you shouldn't do that. What are the chances of being caught? Well, apparently substantial but not hugely high. And so apparently many individuals and even more companies are pursuing those options. Plus, again, many companies would literally be registered in those offshore centers specifically for the purpose of paying lower taxes. Like, for example, Google has big operations or registrations, I guess, going in Ireland, because Ireland has much lower taxes and offers all kinds of other tax-related perks. Many companies would have offices in Switzerland or in Austria or, again, in Panama, Monaco. So in most cases, they would be registered there as, basically a company of, let's say, the Switzerland, a Swiss company. But when you look at what that company looks like, in many cases, it would be just literally a mailbox. Like, there is no staff, there is nobody, just a mailbox, and a registration. Some countries would actually require that a citizen of that country would have stake at the company, so in many cases companies would hire just a random person to just literally just do nothing, be there, and they would pay some amount of money to that person for presumably being the owner of the company or being a co-founder of the company. But so being registered offshore allows them not to pay the 35% tax rate of the United States, or even sometimes higher rates in some countries. And so that's how it kind of starts, that's how it begins. And people just, hate giving up money that they earned. And so that's what it happens. Now, in terms of history of tax havens, they're actually not really new. So we've had them for thousands of years, literally for millennia. The first recorded tax havens or records of tax havens go back to ancient Greece, where sovereign city-states, and as you know, Greece at that time was basically a collection of city-states, would offer all kinds of special treatments to traders, to merchants who would be moving merchandise among those different city-states. And so if you, let's say, for example, store your wealth in one of them, they would give you preferential treatment compared to other city-states, and so as well as all the secrecy and all the other perks of a tax haven. It was taken to the next level by Switzerland in the times of the Second World War. As you know, many rich people were trying to find ways to protect their wealth, and most of Europe was burning in the war, like literally, and so nothing was safe. You couldn't keep your money in the form of, houses or companies, just because at that time, any and every of those could have been bombed. You could have been killed. And so Switzerland remained a neutral country during the war, and Swiss banks basically offered anyone and everyone to invest or put money in their banks in exchange for one, secrecy, second, protection. So, and many people did, and so Switzerland kind of continued on with those practices ever since. Again, some questionable individuals put their money in Swiss banks, like maybe some Nazi party members, but also some, businessmen that were legitimate and, didn't do anything wrong. And so Switzerland kind of perpetuated that business model up until today, and became known for offering excellent security and protection for their clients, both in terms of their identity but also in terms of their money. Now, here is a question that you would have to answer at the exam, on the exam. And the answer clearly is all of the above. Now, this is what we discussed as far as what you personally can do in terms of saving your money, and we kind of talked about that. But when you will be preparing for the exam, you can use this slide to recap all the main points that we just said. Now let's talk about the financial instruments that are specifically designed for international trading. So there are all kinds of different instruments, and we're going to talk about them one by one. So let's first talk about so-called Eurobonds. Well, you know what a bond is, right? A bond it's basically a loan, right? So it's in a sense, piece of paper, and now they're probably mainly electronic, but it would be a piece of paper that says that individual A lended money to individual B, or a corporation or a municipality, and in exchange that borrower, the municipality, corporation, or even individual, promises to pay that money back at a particular time, and usually with an interest. And so it would specify, how soon and in what amount the money would be paid back to the holder of this piece of paper or electronic record. So in a sense, that's when I borrow money, that's what I give to you as a proof that yes, you gave me the money, and yes, I promise to give that money back to you. And normally bonds are issued by, as I said, all kinds of organizations, corporations, municipalities, governments, and so that's a way for them to raise money from people from all, around the country or even around the world. And usually they are used to finance, for example, building of infrastructure or whatever other reasons the government or organization may need to raise money. Now, Eurobonds are basically same pieces of paper, but they are usually denominated, not usually by definition, are denominated in the currency that is different from the currency of the country where they're sold, and they're normally sold internationally. So let's say, for example, your city, whatever country you happen to be from, wants to build a bridge, and they say, well, we need to raise, let's say, $10 million, and so we are willing to borrow from anyone who's willing to give us the money, and we will pay you that amount back, let's say, in 10 years, plus an additional 3 or 5% annual interest rate. And so if they wanted to sell those bonds only in their own country, let's say in the United States, that would be easy. But if they want to sell them overseas, the challenge becomes that different countries have different currencies, and then it's kind of not clear where you would, what currency would you use? Would you be selling them in dollars for dollars, or would you sell them in other countries for their own currency? And so Eurobonds are the bonds where you decided to use a different currency. So for example, you would be selling American bonds for American dollars in Europe, and so they would call them Eurobonds. Now, it's very important to understand that the word euro here has nothing to do with Europe or euro as the currency. So those could be, let's say, Japanese bonds sold for Japanese yen in the United States, or I don't know, Russian bonds sold for American dollars in Europe. So that's definitely a possibility. So the reason they call them Eurobonds is because the practice originated in Europe, and so they initially were really associated with euro. But the name stuck, but it doesn't have to do anything with euro, or it's not limited to Europe or euros today. Now, the big negative or challenge with Eurobonds is that in most countries, Eurobonds are not regulated by the local government. So for example, in the United States, you can sure buy bonds issued by entities from overseas and denominated in a foreign currency, but for American government, they treat them as if you went, let's say, to Europe and bought them for euros, or to Japan and bought them for yen. So they basically don't provide any oversight and any protection in that sort of trade. So you're on your own as if you went to a different country, bought some financial instruments there. If something goes wrong, the US government will say, well, your risk, you did it. So if you were buying bonds in America for American dollars from American bond issuers, then yes, there would be certain regulations, there would be certain organizations in place that kind of track what's going on, and if something goes wrong, the guilty people would be prosecuted, and for some cases there would be even some sort of a governmental insurance. But if it's Eurobonds, it's all, you're on your own. As a result, that increases risk, but at the same time also sometimes yields on Eurobonds are higher than they are on bonds issued in your country and sold for your currency. So as a result, buying Eurobonds in many cases is associated with higher returns as well as higher risks. Now, international bond market also has what we call foreign bonds, and those are bonds that are sold outside the borrower's country, but they are denominated in the currency of the country in which they're sold. So for example, if a Japanese entity wants to sell bonds in the United States and they denominate them in American dollars, then that's what we call the foreign bonds. And so that's, again, perfectly legal. American companies can sell bonds overseas, or entities likewise foreign companies or organizations or municipalities can sell their bonds in the United States, and they can choose to denominate them, let's say, in American dollars. In that case, we would call them foreign bonds, and in most cases they would actually be regulated as if they were issued by American organizations. And so they even have fancy names, like for example, samurai bonds are the bonds sold in Japan, and Yankee bonds are the bonds sold in the United States, bulldog bonds are the bonds sold in the UK, and so on. So again, they have been around for a long time, And usually, basically, they would be, as I said, regulated in most cases just like the local bonds. And so as a result, they're a little less risky, but also potentially the returns would be lower on those investments. Now, here is a question for you. And the answer is C. So Eurobonds are potentially more profitable, offer higher returns due to absence of regulations, though again, as we said before, it's also potentially more risky. So if something goes wrong, you are on your own. Now, international interest rate trading. So this is a fascinating topic. If you travel internationally, especially if you stay in a foreign country for an extended period of time, you will probably notice that banks in different countries lend and borrow money at different rates. And sometimes those rates are hugely different. So as I was saying, from my personal experience, in the United States today, for example, the interest rates on your deposits are roughly 1%, maybe a little bit more if it's a savings account, slightly more though, and maybe just closer to 2% if it's a term deposit. A same investment in, for example, my native Ukraine would yield you anywhere between 10 to 15% if you use dollars, and much more if you use a local currency. And so in many cases, the case is such that borrowing money in one country costs you less than lending that same money in a different country. In other words, actually, let me give you an example from a friend of mine who was in a situation like this. So there was this guy who was originally from Ukraine, from Kiev, and he studied here in the United States. And so while he was still in Ukraine, he had an apartment in Kiev. And prices in Kiev are probably even higher than they are here in North Carolina. So his apartment was worth, let's say, $200,000. And so he moves here for an extended period of time to study, so it's years and years. And so he wants to buy a house here so he doesn't have to pay a high rent. Now he has a choice of selling his house in Ukraine and using that money to buy a house here. And so he sells his house in Ukraine, and so his money sits in the account in Ukraine, and he's ready to pay that money for a house here. But then he talks to banks here and asks, if I were to borrow money to get a mortgage to buy this house, let's say a $200,000 house here, how much would you be charging for that mortgage? And they say, well, today it's going to be 3% annual. And then he keeps his money in Ukraine and looks at his account and like, man, he's getting actually 12% from a Ukrainian bank for keeping that money in that bank. And then he thinks, it wouldn't make sense for me to bring my money from Ukraine to the United States and buy a house here, because if I keep that money in Ukraine and keep getting my, let's say, 12%, and at the same time get a mortgage here at the rate of 3%, I could be getting 9% annually for nothing, just because my money is there and here. And so he does. And so that's basically what the international interest trading is. So you could find that you can borrow money much cheaper, let's say, from the United States at the rate of, let's say, 3%, let's say. Put that same money in an account in a different country that gives you for deposits, let's say, 10, 15%, and basically just get an annual 10-15% for nothing, just basically moving money from one jurisdiction to another. Again, usually interest rates almost perfectly represent the risk level. So meaning that if you do it on a large scale, you will lose sometimes, because there will be some countries where banks will go bankrupt and you will not be able to get your money back at all. So in the end, you're probably not going to get much more than if you were keeping your money in one bank. But if you get lucky, if nothing goes wrong there, you could actually make a lot of money. So for example, again, Ukraine is just because I know more about it, because my parents are there, because I know what the interest rates are. But over the last 15 to 20 years, interest rates in Ukraine were, as I said, on dollar deposits of about 15% on average, maybe 10 to 15 depending on the time. There were times when some banks went bankrupt, not many, but there were some that went bankrupt, and if you happened to have your money in one of those banks, you would literally lose everything. There were also times, including now, when if you have a deposit and you wanted to get your money back, you would be restricted in how much you can get in a given day. And there were even times when you couldn't get anything for several months. So the money would be still there. You log in your account, you look and you see that you have, let's say, $100,000 in the bank, but you're not allowed to withdraw it. At the same time, eventually, in all cases, the money was there and you could still get it sooner or later. So in 2009, I remember there was a really bad period of time when many companies would have money in accounts and wouldn't be able to even pay salary to their workers. Literally, I had a distant relative in Ukraine who was buying and selling some equipment, traffic equipment, and so he made a few sales, so his clients paid to him. He sees the money in his account, let's say 200,000 local whatever currency, and that is more than enough to pay salary to his workers. And he writes checks, and they get the checks, and presumably they got the the money, they got paid. They go to the bank next morning to withdraw the money, and the bank says, "Oh, sorry, you cannot." And so that was a case for a few months in 2009. That was the case where you couldn't get your money back. But then eventually situation stabilized and you could get that money eventually. Same thing now. It's very difficult to get your money from some banks today, but technically you can. And even if you have to withdraw a particular amount of money every single day, you can still get your money back. So over all this time, and I've been here in the United States and North America for about 15 years now, and I always had some savings. And I always held my savings in American dollars in American banks, getting in the better times 3-4% on term deposits, in the times like now getting only about 1% on my deposits. So had I put that money in a Ukrainian bank, and especially if I spread it among several banks, even if one went bankrupt, I wouldn't lose everything. By now, I could have dramatically increased my wealth. So if it's 15% annual over 15 years, I would have actually multiplied my wealth several times, depending on how much I would be adding every year. So definitely it would have made sense. Why am I not doing it now? Well, again, rates are very high now. In fact, now is the best time to invest. But it's also the riskiest time, and I potentially could be making 10-15% a year on my deposits over what I would be making in the United States. But I'm kind of risk averse. I don't want to invest it and risk that one day I may lose my investment. So but then again, maybe it would be a good idea to put some of it in Ukrainian banks, some of it maybe in Russian banks, some maybe in Mexican banks, where again the currencies are less stable and the interest rates are higher. So those are all very legitimate and very viable options, and many people as well as banks do that. And so you could basically make much more money. And so yeah, and here you have a situation, a picture from Ukraine where banks were paying 20%, but at the same time sometimes it was impossible to get your money back. And there were extended periods of time when people couldn't get their money back. And there were also stories like, for example, a man has a sick wife and he has a deposit in the bank, and that deposit is sufficient to pay for her treatment, for her let's say, surgery. But the bank wouldn't allow you to withdraw more than, let's say, $20 a day. And so he literally sprayed himself with gasoline and lit himself up as a sign of protest, and then eventually the bank agreed to pay him, but he lost a lot of his health. I believe he survived in that case. But so risk, yes. Higher returns, yes. Would you like to do that? Well, you might. Here is another question that is likely to be on the exam, and the answer is foreign bonds, B. Now, international equity market, same thing. Again, I'll just give you a story of how it can play out, and you'll understand all the theoretical stuff behind it. Again, I'll go back to my native Ukraine for an example, because this is where you have those big swings, and this is from where you can get those wonderful illustrative stories. You wouldn't get a story like that from the United States or Canada or Europe, because here it's much more stable, and crossing border doesn't really change the situation by much. But in Ukraine it does. It's been experiencing all kinds of problems lately, and so here is one very illustrative example. So in 2004, when Ukraine had its so-called Orange Revolution, and a new president won and the old one basically lost. In the last months before the presidential election, the old president was apparently trying to make some money, and so they decided to privatize or sell some of the state companies. One of those companies was Stal. That's a steel mill, one of the biggest in the world. So it's one of those plants that makes steel, turns the iron ore into steel products. As I said, it's one of the largest in the world, and it's a very valuable piece of assets. And so in Ukraine, it was sold right before the presidential election, and incidentally, there was presumably an auction, and so the person who won the auction happened to be the son-in-law of the president. And the company was sold for $800 million, which is nothing compared to what it should be for a company of that type. And so essentially you saw the case when the president family, in a sense, stole a very valuable company by paying only a very small fraction of what it's really worth. And as I said, there was presumably an auction, and there was presumably some competition. But again, presumably that was the largest amount that the government could raise for that company in the domestic market. Now, when the new president won the election, one of his kind of campaign promises was to re-nationalize that company, that steel mill, and then re-auction it again and sell it now internationally, so with bidders coming from all around the world, and hopefully getting a bigger price for it. And so they did. And so just a few months later, the company was renationalized and then reprivatized. But this time they had an auction that went beyond the borders of Ukraine, and so they sold it just a few months later for $4.8 billion, which was 6 times the original price. Now imagine you have something you want to sell, let's say, I don't know, cell phone or company that you have. You can literally make 6 times as much as you go international. And again, in Ukraine, obviously the auction was probably rigged domestically, but then again, nobody stepped forward and said that I can offer you more money. Whatever tactics they used, that was the maximum that the government could get from domestic buyers. Going international, you got so much more. And so here is the kind of lesson for both traders and buyers. For traders, those who sell either company equity or whatever else you're selling, you can get much more money if you are willing to sell not only domestically but internationally, right? Same thing for buyers. You can get a lucrative piece of property or company that may be for sale overseas, where the local bidders cannot offer much, and maybe where foreign bidders don't know about that auction. So by shopping internationally, you can get much more better products for much less money. And so that's where you basically, that's the logic behind that. Now, you also have what we call Eurocurrency Market. That's basically, in a sense, you keep foreign currencies in your domestic banks. So, and again, the word euro here is used because the practice originated in Europe. It has nothing to do with euro per se. So here we are talking about deposits that you can have in foreign currencies in a bank in your own country. For example, when I lived in Canada, since I was going to the United States on a regular basis, I had an account that allowed me to hold my savings in American dollars in a Canadian bank. And so going to the United States, I would be using a credit card linked to that account so that I don't have to exchange currencies back and forth all the time. So this made it more easier, and that's basically what I had, Eurocurrency. So for example, euro dollars, American dollars deposited in a, for example, Japanese bank. And so they call them euro dollars because Japan uses a different currency. Again, most banks, at least in kind of so-called free developed countries like the United States, like most of Europe, Canada, Australia, have no problems with that. It's perfectly legal. You can have accounts either for all kinds of different currencies or of a specific different currency. And again, you might want to have it if you go to that country on a regular basis or if you do business with that country. So this way it allows you to avoid, on the one hand, changing currencies all the time. On the other hand, who knows, maybe you believe that your country's currency may lose in value and Eurocurrency may stay more stable. Again, Euro as the Eurocurrency or a foreign currency. And so, let's say if you live in Ukraine and you don't believe in Ukrainian hryvnia, you may have an account in American dollars, and that's legal and that's perfectly fine and can offer all kinds of benefits. Now, let's talk about exchange markets. Here, the trick is that people often think that they know a lot about foreign or currency exchanges, because I mean, we all traveled overseas, we all bought and sold foreign currencies, so what's there to know? But there is actually much more to it than what a regular person knows, and so let me give you some examples. So let's talk about issues related to foreign financial markets one by one. First, you have what we call price arbitrage. What that is that sometimes you may be in a situation where you see that a particular product or currency or financial instrument is sold cheaper here than is bought there. Let me give you an example, kind of a primitive one. I probably shouldn't be telling about it, but it's like from 15 years ago when we first came to the United States, and it's a very primitive one, but one that illustrates very well what a price arbitrage is. So we lived at that time, I believe it was in Dallas, and there they had Walmart and Target, two stores that sell all kinds of stuff, literally across the street from one another. Now those stores are very supportive or customer oriented, and if you buy a product there and you don't like it, you can return it. In many cases you can return the product even if you don't have the receipt. So in those days they would just literally just give you the cash back as long as they see that the product is one that they sell. Today normally they would actually give you what they call in-store credit. But anyway, you can still return a product even if you don't have the receipt. And so my wife goes to one of those stores and she sees that a particular object, merchandise, let's say, I don't even remember what that was, but let's say, for example, it was, I don't know, a t-shirt, right? Is sold for $10, let's say, at Walmart. And then she goes to shop at Target and she notices that exactly the same shirt from the same manufacturer is sold at Target for, let's say, $11. So she goes to Walmart, buys, I believe, 2 of those t-shirts, crosses the street, comes to Target and says, I bought those earlier here, I would like to return them, I don't have the receipt. They say, no problem, ma'am, we're going to take them back. And so they take them back and give my wife $11 for each of them in cash or in-store credit. And so by spotting this opportunity, by spotting this price difference, she was able to make $2, and she was very proud of her, and at that time it was a big deal. Obviously she wouldn't do that today, and I'm not even sure if it's legal. Probably it's not, I don't know. So, but anyway, in the student days when we were poor, I believe once she told me that she did it and, you know, earned whole $2. And so that's the price arbitrage, again, kind of in a primitive way. Usually it's a little different. I mean, in the kind of international business context, first it would be international. Second, people would be using it at a much larger scale. And so what they would see is that, for example, let's say somebody's selling oil or lumber or whatever other, you know, commodity in one country for less, and somebody is buying that same commodity or product in a different country for more. And you would buy literally $1 million worth of that commodity in one country and sell it in another instantly or as fast as you can, and let's say make that 1% or 2% difference on the trade. And so in a matter of a few hours you can make that 1% extra or 2%. And in reality you may never even touch that particular, you know, product, but you would kind of sell it on paper, and so now the buyer, your buyer in, let's say, country B, kind of owns that product from country A, and then you just arrange for transportation, and you know, and thereby you can still make some money. And so if you do it with a large enough amount, then you can earn some money. Interest arbitrage, that's basically what we discussed with that friend who was borrowing money from one country and depositing it in another. So same thing. So if you see that one country's bank is willing to lend you money, let's say at 2%, and another country's bank is willing to borrow money from you at, let's say, 10%, you can literally just borrow here, move there instantaneously, as fast as you can, and then just enjoy the difference. And so you would need to be paying that money back to the first bank, but it would be enough to use the interest from one to pay for the interest in another, and you would even have a healthy profit from there. Finally, exchange rate is basically the same thing. Exchange rate arbitrage, that's when you have a situation where, let's say, for example, Canadian dollars are sold for less in the United States than they are bought in Canada. And so you may literally be able to buy Canadian dollars, let's say, for example, with your whatever currency you have in the United States, let's say for, I don't know, 97 cents US each, but then you can sell them in Canada for, let's say, 98 cents each. And so that 1% difference allows you to instantly make 1% profit. And today the exchange rates are more like 87%. It doesn't really matter, but the point is, if you identify opportunities where a currency is sold in one location cheaper than it's bought in another one, you can literally buy a lot there, resell here, and thereby make some small profit. It could be, anywhere between 1 to maybe 5, or maybe, if you like, even more percent. So that's what we call arbitrage. Now here is a question for you, and clearly the answer is currency arbitrage is an instantaneous purchase and sale of a currency in different markets for profit. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about cross rates. This stuff you kind of know, and this is common sense. As long as you know math, you can definitely figure that out. And if you ever bought or sold currencies, you probably know how this stuff works. No need to, I'm not going to go into the formulas, because again, I know that you know, but if you don't, read the textbook and look at the formulas to know. What I want to talk about is so-called spot rates versus buy-sell rates. Now, when the time comes for you to buy or sell currencies, you will be faced with a few choices, and depending on which one you may make a hugely different, or the transaction can cause you hugely different amounts of money. So first, spot rates. It's a little bit more complicated than what I'm going to say now, but essentially what that is the price at which big banks and traders sell or swap currencies with one another. So when you listen to, for example, the news, and you hear that, let's say, the euro is $1.2, or the Canadian dollar is 87 US dollars, 0.87 US dollars. Those one number, or that one single number that shows you the exchange rate, is the spot rate. So that's the rate at which, the banks could buy and sell from each other those currencies. Now, when you land in a different country and you want to buy a foreign currency, let's say, for example, you go and travel to Australia and you land in Australia, in Sydney at the airport, and you want to buy some Australian dollars, you are likely to see something like what you see here on the picture. So for each currency, you will see two numbers, right? One number will be the buy rate, and the other number would be the sell rate. And so what that is that, let's say you want to buy a Canadian dollar or an Australian dollar with American dollars, you would see that if you want to buy a Canadian dollar, you would have to pay, let's say, 95 cents for each Canadian dollar. But if you wanted to sell a Canadian dollar, you would get only 85 cents from the trader. And so there is this kind of gap, that spread, as they call it, between the buy and sell rate. And so usually the spread is anywhere between 2 to 5%. And so that's the bank's profit. So by selling more expensively, by buying cheaper, they basically finance the currency exchange operation, and that's how they make profits. Now, you would also notice that the spread is different for different currencies. So for some currencies it would be like plus or minus only 1 or 2%. For some currencies it would be plus or minus 10% or even 15%. And so usually that reflects the risk of the volatility of that currency. So for example, if you wanted to buy or sell Russian rubles today, or Ukrainian hryvnia, currencies that are very unstable because of the known events that are going on there, you would see that the spreads are very high for those currencies, and that's because banks know that the currency can change its value dramatically in a matter of hours, so they increase the spread so that they can still make the profit even if the currency fluctuations will, dramatically reduce profitability. So they basically hedge against that loss. If the currency is more stable, you could see a spread that is much lower. And so because the bank knows, the currency is not likely to change the value much, so we're still going to make those, 1 or 2% or whatever they. Yeah. So now most of us people, we would be using buy and sell rates. We would not be allowed to buy at a spot rate unless you're a huge client of a bank, and the bank may kind of give them the price that they themselves pay when they swap their currencies with other banks. Now, what's important is that depending on what choice you make, you can pay a different amount of money for your foreign currency transaction purchase. I'll use my example here to illustrate how sometimes it becomes important. For example, if you are traveling to a different country, you normally change several $100s, maybe a couple $1,000s. Hardly ever when you go on vacation for a few days, you spend more than that amount of money. And so in most cases, it doesn't really matter for you what the buy-sell rates are, because so what? You lose 2%. All right, well, you want to buy $1,000, you lose $20, $30 in that transaction. Big deal, not a huge deal, right? Now, imagine that you own a business and your business is buying and selling stuff in hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of a sudden, that 2-3%, the spread, becomes a big issue, because if you are buying an equipment, let's say for a combine, that's something that I kind of used to do as I was part of a company that was buying and selling agricultural machinery. A combine can cost anywhere between $200,000 to sometimes even $300,000 or $400,000 depending on the equipment. So on $200,000, 2-3%, that may be literally $4,000 plus or minus just in the fees. And so $4,000, that's a lot of money. You don't want to spend that money, because all of a sudden that's a substantial amount. That's something that you could buy a used car for one of your employees, or you could keep someone on payroll for a year if it was in Ukraine for that money. And again, if the spread is higher, you can easily be losing thousands of dollars on that amount. So if the spread is 5 or 10%, you could literally tens of thousands of dollars on a purchase of a combine. And so that's when you realize that you actually have different options. And so you can just simply go to one of those currency exchange booths and pay a high premium for buying currency, or you can see that there are online traders, for example, or brokers that can offer you a much lower price. In my case, my last situation where I was kind of struggling with this issue was when I moved from Canada to the United States in 2009. And at that time, I had all my money in Canadian dollars for obvious reasons. And I didn't have much, but I had just enough to buy a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom townhouse here in the United States. So it's like, a detached house. And so it was, let's say, it was slightly less, but $100,000 roughly. And so buying or moving that kind of money across the border and buying or converting the Canadian dollars into American dollars with a spread of, let's say, 5%, all of a sudden you would be losing $5,000. It's a huge amount of money for me. I mean, like, why did I lose so much? And again, it was a somewhat lower amount, but roughly that amount. And then I was starting doing some exploration, and I found that you could have options where you can save a lot of money. In fact, for example, I found that online traders could give you, and I have here some of the links, I believe, right here. Somewhere I will have a link for you, that you can go online, and online traders could allow you to change your currencies for a fixed, let's say, $25 fee. And again, if you were changing only $100, it wouldn't make sense. But if you have $100,000, you could basically have the transaction for virtually no cost, percentage-wise. Now, in my case, I was struggling. I didn't know what to do with that. So I was kind of worried about changing my money through the online traders, because it was all I had. And if you change your money at a bank, first they give you the money back right away, or at least, transfer it into your account right away. And if something goes wrong, you know where to go and whom to talk to and whom to complain, because there is a building where there is a person that you can talk to, and if they don't listen to you, you can sue them or call the police. With online traders, there is only a website, and so normally what that involves is that you kind of have to open an account with them, transfer your money in that account, make the transaction, and then move the money back to your account. And I did some some research online, and they seem to be very safe. I mean, those are legitimate traders. It seems to be safe enough. But then I was still not comfortable, so I decided not to go that route. What I did in the end was I found out that my bank, and at that time I was with TD Canada, so Trust Dominion Canada, which offered an option of a better exchange rate if you open one of the, I believe they called it a borderless account. So it was an account in which you could hold your currencies in foreign currencies, so in US dollars including, and if you were buying American dollars by moving your Canadian dollars to that account, instead of the regular price, which at that time I believe the spread was around 3%, they were offering about 1%. So I was saving roughly 2% on the transaction and paying a total of about 1% on the transaction. So instead of paying $3,000 or $4,000 I would have been paying if I just simply showed up at the bank and asked to exchange the currencies, I was paying only about $1,000 for the transaction, which was still a lot of money. Out of nothing you would lose it. But it was still much better than otherwise, and I felt the added safety of going with a bank I trusted was worthwhile paying that extra $1,000 instead of just paying a $25 fixed fee. So just something to keep in mind. You probably will forget most of it by the time you graduate, but keep in mind that there are different options, and when the time comes for you to make this big purchase for your company overseas for foreign currency, just remember that there are different options. At that time you'll just go to the bank, ask them, and they'll repeat what I just told you in more detail. Now, another big challenge is that when you trade internationally, you have to change currencies, but it's not even that you have the exchange rate cost. I mean, you have that buy-sell rate difference, the spread. You also may be in a situation where currency exchange rates would change over time, and the product that would be accessible or attainable to you today, affordable, may not be tomorrow, because your currency may lose some value compared to the currency in which you would be buying the product. For example, in Canada there is a company called Bombardier, and they make small airplanes. Well, not small, airplanes that are anywhere 10 to 50 or maybe 100 people in terms of the number of passengers. So those are not your huge Boeing or Airbus airplanes that you would normally see in the airports. Those are smaller regional airplanes that normally are used for short hauls. So they would have only like a dozen passengers or a little more. And so let's say you want to buy one of those airplanes. Let's say you're a local airline and you want to buy a Bombardier to service your local, domestic market. And an airplane like that costs somewhere close to $1 million. Probably a little bit more, but for the sake of argument, let's say it's $1 million. Canadian dollars. And let's assume that today you have enough money to buy one Bombardier, so you have, let's say, 870,000 American dollars, and you can buy one for 1 million Canadian dollars, because that's how much your American dollars can buy today. The problem is that today Canadian dollars is undervalued. So historically, for the last decade or so, it's been about 1-to-1 with the American dollar. And then when the oil prices went down a few months ago, the Canadian dollar lost about 13-14% of its value against the American dollar. Now we see that the oil prices are slightly slowly going up again, and there is a very, very good chance that in a matter of a few months the Canadian dollar will be again 1-to-1 with the American dollar. Now, when you order an airplane, it will probably take a few months for the company, for Bombardier, to make that airplane. So you can sign the contract today and you will say that, let's say in half a year, I'm going to buy that airplane, I'm going to pay you $1 million Canadian, and you can be very confident that you have that money because today you have 870,000 American dollars, which is equivalent to 1 million Canadian dollar. The problem is that by the time the airplane is ready and you have to pay for it, Canadian dollar may go back up to 1-to-1 with American dollar, and all of a sudden you will find yourself in a situation where your 870 American dollars are not sufficient to buy $1 million Canadian dollars, and so as a result you may not be able to fulfill your obligation, contractual obligation. And so how do you make sure that you will have enough money at that time? How do you make sure that you will be able to buy the necessary amount of currency at that time? And so here's where we have all kinds of different tricks or instruments that the banks have invented to offer you that safety. So you have forward rate or forward contract, currency future contract, currency option, and currency swap. And you can read the definitions here on the slide or in the book, but essentially what those are is that either the bank or the seller kind of promises you a particular interest or exchange rate, exchange rate at a particular date. So for example, forward rate would be the simplest version of these four, and that's where you kind of sign a contract with the bank where the bank says, yes, I will sell you $1 million Canadian dollars at the 87 cents per dollar on, let's say, September the 1st. And so that gives you the guarantee that at the time when the time comes to buy that currency, you will have the rate that you need. The problem is that there are all kinds of prices associated with these safety measures. So for example, the bank may have a contract with you where you promise to buy that amount of currency at a particular date, and they promise you to give you the rate, but you will have to buy it no matter what. If the currencies exchange rates will change by that time, and let's say the Canadian dollar becomes, who knows, maybe only 60 cents, you would still have to buy, and in that case lose a lot of money. So you know that you will be able to buy the product, but had you known that the currency rate would go down, you would actually wait because you would, that's profitable for you, but you would be obliged to pay. More often than not, there is also some sort of a kind of fee associated with that transaction. So the bank would say, yes, sure, we will sell you at that rate, but it will cost you an additional 1 or 2%. And so this way, the bank doesn't really care if the price will go up or down. So, sometimes it will go up, sometimes it will go down. And so in the long run, the bank will still get roughly, the price that they promised, or, the average. So basically, there would be no profit in drop or increase of the price. But they will get that extra 1 or 2% that they charge you for the safety, and so that's how they make money. And so by doing it all the time, all over again, and with different currencies, the fluctuations kind of cancel out, but they get a fee. And so there could be all kinds of other arrangements that are more complex, but that's the idea. So you get the peace of mind that at the day when the time comes, you can get the the necessary amount of the dollars or currency that you need. But at the same time, again, you could be losing because the price may actually move in your favor. You could be losing because there is a fee associated with that transaction. There could be all kinds of other costs associated with that transaction. But again, sometimes it would still be feasible to buy one of those, contracts or get one of those contracts. Just like with insurance. If everything goes fine, you will lose a small, fee or a small percent, and yes, it's unpleasant, but no big deal. But if something goes wrong and you don't happen to have one of those future contracts or forward rate contracts, that may jeopardize your ability to fulfill your contractual obligation, which may lead to all kinds of much bigger problems. So it's in a sense sort of an insurance that allows you to, to ensure that you will have the resources necessary to buy foreign currencies. Now, here is another important question. Why not currencies always freely traded? In many countries, at different periods of their history, it may be impossible to buy or sell foreign currencies. I happened to have lived in a country like that in Ukraine, where in the 90s, There were times when you wouldn't be allowed to buy foreign currencies at all, or there would be certain restrictions in place. Why would a government restrict trade in foreign currencies? Normally, there would be a number of reasons, and we'll talk about them one by one. But the way first the government can restrict foreign currency trading is either they would completely make it impossible for banks or illegal for banks to sell foreign currencies, or they would have all kinds of trade barriers in place where you kind of are allowed to buy foreign currency or sell foreign currency, but you would have to go through a process where you have to apply for a permit, where it takes a long time, and so it takes so much time and effort to buy and sell that you at some time may give up. For example, in the late 90s, I worked in Ukraine for a company that was engaged in all kinds of agricultural, industrial-related activities, and I worked for the division that was responsible for buying and selling agricultural machinery like plows and tractors and combines and that kind of stuff. And so we were buying it from all around the world. Like, for example, the machine you see on the picture here, it's a Kverneland seeder. So this one was from Norway. And so if you wanted to buy it from Norway, you obviously had to buy the Norwegian krones first and then buy the machine for that money. And so at that time, if we wanted to buy a foreign product, like, for example, the one that you see here, we would have to apply for a permit from the bank. So basically submit a copy of the contract to a bank, and I believe it was actually eventually going to the central bank, and they would review the contract and then either approve or disapprove your purchase of the foreign currency. And normally they would approve it. I mean, at that time it wasn't too strict, so normally you would get the permission to buy the foreign currency and send the foreign currency overseas, which was another barrier. But it would take a long time, and literally it would take sometimes weeks and weeks before you could even make the payment, even though you had the resources to buy that product. And so that created all kinds of administrative barriers and hurdles. The reason the governments may not be willing to allow you to buy and sell foreign currencies is, one, to fight inflation. If your local currency is unstable, people tend to sell local currency right away and buy foreign currency. For example, again, in Ukraine at that time, you would want to sell your local whatever currency was at that time, because we went through several. And you want to keep your money in dollars or then later in euros. And so that increased the supply of the local currency, which reduced its value, which eventually led to the inflation of prices. And the government didn't want to do that, or didn't wanted to prevent that, and so as a result they would impose all kinds of restrictions. Sometimes the governments would also impose restrictions due, for self-benefit, for corruption, basically. So if it's difficult to buy and sell currencies, and if there is only one or two banks in the country that are allowed to do that, and if you happen to kind of own that bank, you can make a lot of money. Or if you don't even directly own it, but you control it, you can make a lot of money. And so as a result, some governments do that as a business. So what happens in those cases is that you would see private small traders on the streets. Like, here is a picture here of one where literally a person stands on the street and just exchanges currencies. And in Ukraine, I remember there were a few spots in the city where like intersections, crossroads, where there would be several of those currency traders walking around. And so the one you see on the picture actually has a vest that identifies him as a currency trader. But in Ukraine at that time, it was illegal to sell currency on the streets, so they would be kind of looking inconspicuous, just regular individuals just walk around and would say like rubli, dolari, marочки, rubli, dolari, marочки, so rubles, dollars, and Deutsche Marks. It was before euro. And you approach one of them, like, how much, and he tells you the the exchange rate, and you change it right there. And then if you have a larger amount, you sometimes would walk away so that you're not spotted by the police. At that time, I was buying and selling cars buying in Germany, selling in Ukraine. And so I was buying and selling currencies in larger amounts, more frequently. So for people like me, there was a little restaurant close to one of those places. And so the bigger traders, kind of the chiefs of the traders, would just sit there all day at a table pretending to be having lunch. and you just sit down at the table and you deal with them, so they know you personally, you know, your face, so that makes it more safe, so the police will not spot. And I suspect they'll probably, you know, the police knew about them and they probably paid something to the police for their business. But in any case, that's, you basically have that black market for currency trade. So when it's not possible to buy it officially, that's what happens, you know, unofficial. And so today in Ukraine in 2015, you kind of have that similar situation where currency trade is allowed, but banks just say they don't have the currency because they are under certain restrictions as to, you know, how much they can charge for currencies and all kinds of other stuff that the government put in place to keep them exchange rate under control. And so, and then all those unofficial black market traders sprout, and that's what many people have to use. And you know, they have kind of more realistic exchange rates and sometimes higher, and so on. Then also sometimes governments may want to have some foreign currency to service their debt. If they got some loans from, I don't know, like World Bank or other countries, and they need to have foreign currency to pay that debt, you know, to pay the interests. If the bank was offering to buy foreign currencies through the central bank and then commercial banks as the next level, the government would have to spend its foreign currency reserves, and so the bank, the government may just not be in a position to have that luxury, and so as a result, they just don't flood the market with foreign currencies, and as a result, commercial banks don't sell foreign currencies just because they don't have anywhere to buy it, and so as a result, that would be the case. And I remember in Ukraine in the 90s, the inflation in the country was at some point reaching 10,000% a year, very, very high. And so the local currencies were losing value so fast that there were times when they would be paid literally, like salaries would be paid literally twice a day. And you would get your pay at 12 o'clock and you try to spend it over the lunch break, because by the time you are done with your work for the day, the inflation is so huge that you may lose, you know, 10, 20, 30% of that value. And then you would be paid again at the end of the day, and then again you would try to spend it before tomorrow, because by tomorrow the prices would go up by a few percent. And so when the situation is like that, the government definitely tries to, you know, do something about it, because people would unload all the currencies that they have and buy foreign currency just because that has some, you know, stability, as well as the government may need to be paying debt in a foreign currency. And if the government was selling all the foreign dollars or whatever currency we are talking about right away, they would just be left with nothing to service the debt. So yeah, tough times. Now here is a question for you, and the answer is a forward rate. This is what you need to know on the exam. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video lecture.